Stephanie White, in her post-game press conference, giving credit to the Atlanta Dream while simultaneously taking shots at her own players, but even more that I caught, calling out herself and not even...
There comes a moment when you have to be honest with yourself and face the reality staring back at you. That's essentially the message Stephanie White delivered after the Indiana Fever suffered yet another defensive breakdown, this time against the Atlanta Dream. But here's where things start to get really interesting. The post-game press conference revealed far more than most people noticed at first. She appeared to be holding everyone accountable except the one person with the ultimate influence over what unfolds on the floor. And what happened next was even more surprising. The reporters in that room wrapped things up after just 2 minutes and 26 seconds of questioning. Just 2 minutes, despite a performance where the Fever allowed a staggering 60 points in the paint.
With about 3 minutes to go, what did you feel like were the defensive failings in that last couple of minutes? You guys gave up 13 points in that stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I thought we let him get to the rim too easily. That was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings.
That was the story of when you had your defensive...
It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for them to pass the ball around the perimeter, and they're fast. When they catch it on the run and attack our feet, we're already behind. And there were some times where we didn't have rotations. I thought they did an excellent job in terms.
Sometimes you got...
Did you catch what just happened there? Stephanie White gave credit to the Atlanta Dream for doing the exact thing her own team struggles to do on a consistent basis. She praised their ability to attack the paint from multiple angles instead of relying on the same repetitive actions over and over again. But that's where the irony becomes impossible to ignore. What she described is practically the complete blueprint of Indiana's offense every single game. Feed the ball to Aaliyah Boston in the post, let Kelsey Mitchell create isolation plays, or put Caitlin Clark in one-on-one situations and hope for the best. Beyond that, there's very little variety, imagination, or advanced offensive design. In the same breath, she applauded the Dream's versatility while unintentionally exposing how predictable and stagnant her own offense has become. And somehow it seemed to go unnoticed. That's more than just an awkward comment. It points to a surprising lack of self-awareness from a coach who's built her reputation as a defensive specialist.
You guys never have you've never had rotations this entire season, sans one game. And that comes down to you as a defensive coach and your butt buddy Brianne January as a defensive assistant coach. There's no rotations ever defensively for this team. Late getting to players, Stephanie White, you didn't have this team looked like they were uninspired and not prepared. Look in the mirror.
In terms of their spacing to make our rotations very difficult. But we've got to be able to guard one-on-one, and more than anything, we got to defend without fouling. I mean, we cannot continue to let people live, in the 20s and 30s.
Now, pay close attention to this next part because it reveals something most people are missing. She's discussing late defensive rotations and how Indiana failed to make Atlanta work for passes around the perimeter. The problem is, none of this is new. This has been a recurring issue for the Fever throughout nearly the entire season. Aside from perhaps one exception, the same weaknesses have shown up game after game. Under Stephanie White's system, this team has never demonstrated reliable, consistent defensive rotations for an extended stretch. But here's the key point that somehow keeps getting overlooked. Stephanie White is the coach responsible for the defense. Brianne January serves as the team's defensive assistant coach. If rotations continue breaking down, if players repeatedly arrive late to their assignments, and if opposing offenses are allowed to operate comfortably, that reflects a coaching issue as much as anything else. You can't build a reputation as a defensive expert and then shift all the responsibility onto the players when your defense remains near the bottom of the league in paint protection. Atlanta finished with 60 points in the paint. They also generated 20 points off turnovers and added another 17 points in transition. Numbers like that aren't simply the result of one rough night. They are usually signs of deeper defensive problems that a coaching staff is expected to identify, address, and correct.
You're talking to. I wonder who you're talking about. Defend without fouling. Couldn't be talking about Aaliyah Boston because you never criticize Aaliyah Boston. Can't be talking about Kelsey Mitchell because I've never seen you say one negative thing about Kelsey. It has to be Caitlin Clark. Somebody who picked up 2 fouls last night. 2 fouls, both of which, if challenged, probably would have gotten overturned. At minimum, one of them would have gotten overturned. But instead, you waste your challenge on Sophie Cunningham pulling down Ryan Howard.
And right there, that's the moment that caught my attention. When she talks about defending without fouling, many fans immediately understand the message she's trying to send. Anyone who has followed this team closely can probably guess who the focus is on. Public criticism rarely seems directed toward Aaliyah Boston. You almost never hear Kelsey Mitchell singled out by name either. Yet when it comes to Caitlin Clark, the indirect comments and subtle critiques continue to spark debate. Caitlin was charged with 2 fouls in that matchup against Atlanta. Both calls appeared questionable enough that many believed they deserved a closer review. At the very least, there was a strong argument that one of those fouls could have been overturned with a properly used coach's challenge. But Stephanie White chose not to challenge either call. Instead, the challenge was used on a play involving Sophie Cunningham bringing down Te-Hina Paopao, a decision that many viewed as having little chance of success. It wasn't the type of call most observers considered highly debatable. What makes the situation even more interesting is that critics point out White has rarely used challenges to defend her starting point guard throughout the season, not once, according to those frustrated fans. Meanwhile, Clark has found herself dealing with foul trouble during key stretches of games, creating situations that some believe could have been handled differently if the coaching decisions had been more favorable in those moments.
Monique Billings is bigger than Michaela Timmons, by the way. Monique Billings is a waste of $850,000. Terrible free agent signing. Oh, they played big. Oh, well, wait. Haven't fans been saying that this team's too small for the longest? Haven't we been saying that? Haven't we been saying we should have gotten the other player from South Carolina that's an actual big, but instead you get Raven Johnson? Okay, I'm on board with Raven Johnson now, but she's only playing 3 minutes in games now? So we wasted a first-round pick on somebody that we don't even trust fully yet? And we'd rather have Ty Harris, and Ty Harris doesn't give us anything offensively or defensively? She's just an old fling you had over there at Connecticut? Interesting.
You know, she does a really good job of anticipating, and she just gave us a different look.
Caitlin goes out in that fourth quarter early on. I think you guys were down about double digits, and you guys rally after that. What did you think of the response from the team, and specifically Aaliyah?
And this is where the conversation becomes even more difficult to ignore. Stephanie White highlighted KK's length, active hands, and ability to defend multiple positions on the floor. To be fair, those are legitimate strengths, and KK absolutely brings energy along with valuable defensive flexibility. But then she pointed out that Atlanta played with size, almost as if it were an unexpected challenge. The surprising part is that fans have been raising concerns about Indiana's lack of size since the very beginning of training camp. The Fever had the chance to select Camila Cardosa, a true rim-protecting post player out of South Carolina, yet they ultimately chose Raven Johnson instead. Raven has shown flashes of potential, but at the moment she's only seeing limited minutes. So now you're looking at a situation where a first-round selection isn't playing a major role, while Monique Billings is earning significant money without making a consistent impact. And then there's Tyasha Harris, who continues receiving rotation opportunities, leading some critics to question whether familiarity from previous coaching relationships is playing a role. The issue, according to those critics, is that the production simply hasn't matched the playing time. There hasn't been enough offensive creation or defensive influence to justify a larger role. As a result, some fans believe roster decisions are being influenced more by past connections than by current performance levels. When Atlanta leaned into its size advantage, Indiana struggled to respond. They lacked the physical presence, the length, and the defensive structure needed to offset those disadvantages. That's partly a roster-building issue that naturally raises questions for the front office, but it's also fair to question the coaching staff when adjustments aren't made to get the most out of the players currently available.
You guys are moving it. Ball side to side. There's another shot at CC22. That's all she does. Subliminal.
And knocked him down.
The Dream had 60 points in the paint.
Kelsey Mitchell made shots in the fourth quarter. That's what it was. Kelsey Mitchell made shots.
Just what was the breakdown in the paint that you saw? What was the breakdown in the paint that you saw? Had 60 points in the paint. Just what was the breakdown in the paint that you saw?
I think there are multiple,
Team's not big enough. Team's not strong enough. Team's too soft. Team has no length. Outside of Michaela Timpson, not really the most athletic bunch defensively. Team doesn't slide. Too vertical in their defensive stance. Don't get low enough.
There's when you get layups, 20 points off turnovers, 17 fast break points. It's our turnovers are killing us. Our turnovers, some of our poor shot selection, they go down the other end, you get a layup most of the time. So that was part of it. Some of it was poor rotation, poor one-on-one D. That's what this team does. They
Now pay very close attention to this part because it may be the most revealing moment of the entire press conference. Stephanie White argued that the ball moved from side to side more effectively during the fourth quarter when Caitlin Clark was off the floor, leading to higher quality scoring opportunities. Think about that for a second. The head coach essentially credited improved ball movement to stretches when the team's most gifted playmaker wasn't even playing. Caitlin Clark leads the league in assists. She's already established herself as one of the most dynamic passers the WNBA has ever seen at this stage of a career. Yet the praise was directed toward the offense functioning when she was sitting on the bench. That's not the type of observation that goes unnoticed. To many fans, it sounded less like objective analysis and more like another subtle criticism wrapped inside a basketball explanation. Then, White shifted the focus to Kelsey Mitchell knocking down shots in the fourth quarter, and honestly, that explanation says a lot by itself. The success wasn't credited to a brilliant set, a creative adjustment, or a perfectly executed offensive system. The takeaway was simply that Kelsey made tough shots. That's been the formula far too often. Rely on talented players to create difficult offense on their own and hope the results follow. There doesn't appear to be a consistent structure generating easy opportunities away from the ball. There aren't enough actions designed to create advantages before the defense gets set. Meanwhile, Atlanta consistently ran organized offensive sets with multiple options available on nearly every possession. They attacked the paint through movement, screens, cuts, and post actions coming from different areas of the floor. Indiana's offense often feels much simpler. Let Kelsey create, throw it to Aaliyah Boston, or ask Caitlin Clark to solve the problem herself. And when those possessions succeed, the coaching decisions receive praise. When they don't, the conversation quickly shifts toward execution, effort, or player mistakes. That's why this discussion goes far beyond a single loss or one uncomfortable media session. What many people are noticing is a pattern that appears to have developed throughout the season, a pattern where accountability seems to move everywhere except toward the system itself. And as pressure increases, those questions become harder to ignore. Stephanie White arrived with a clear reputation. She was presented as a defensive-minded coach, a former Fever player, an Indiana native, and someone capable of fixing the team's biggest weaknesses. The organization provided personnel, support staff, and the flexibility needed to implement her approach. Yet the results continued to raise concerns. Indiana still struggles defending the paint, still experiences breakdowns in rotations, and still gives up too many easy transition baskets. Allowing 60 points in the paint against Atlanta doesn't look like a random one-game issue. It looks more like evidence of ongoing defensive problems that have yet to be solved. And instead of focusing on whether the scheme itself needs adjustment, much of the discussion centers on players fouling, players lacking readiness, or players failing to execute assignments. But here's the question that deserves attention. If the same mistakes continue happening game after game, at what point does responsibility extend beyond the players? If execution remains inconsistent regardless of the opponent, doesn't it become fair to evaluate the system as well? Eventually, every team has to examine the common denominator. Sometimes the issue isn't just execution. Sometimes the structure itself may need to change. And that's why the challenge decisions continue to stand out. Passing on opportunities to challenge key fouls involving Caitlin Clark isn't viewed by critics as merely a tactical error. To them, it's part of a larger pattern that raises questions about priorities and decision-making. And this is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus. When a coach appears to protect certain players while others seem to receive less support, and when valuable challenges are used on low-probability reviews instead of potentially preserving crucial minutes for star players, people naturally begin questioning the priorities behind those decisions. Then there's the media availability itself. 2 minutes and 26 seconds simply isn't enough time to fully explore topics like defensive breakdowns, offensive struggles, rotation choices, or late-game adjustments. Critics argue that the structure of those press conferences limits deeper conversations before they can really begin. The result is a setting where difficult questions often remain unanswered. And when accountability isn't consistently applied, concerns only continue to grow. Look around professional sports when teams suffer major defensive collapses. Coaches are often asked detailed follow-up questions for 10, 15, sometimes even 20 minutes. Reporters push for specifics, challenge explanations, and demand clarity about future adjustments. That's part of the job. But in this case, many observers feel the conversations end before meaningful scrutiny can take place, and that's where frustration starts building among fans. Building a championship culture requires accountability at every level of an organization. Players can't be the only people expected to answer for mistakes. Likewise, long-term problems rarely improve if the system itself is never questioned. That's why so many people continue discussing the environment surrounding this team. Consider the position it potentially creates for players, especially Caitlin Clark. Critics point to indirect comments during press conferences, the handling of foul situations, and remarks about offensive flow during stretches when she isn't on the floor. Whether intentional or not, those moments become talking points. Naturally, people begin asking what message that sends throughout the locker room. Trust between players and coaches is one of the most important foundations of any successful team. If fans perceive inconsistency in how players are defended publicly, those perceptions can quickly become part of the larger narrative. The contrast is something supporters frequently debate. Aaliyah Boston often receives praise for her contributions. Kelsey Mitchell is recognized when she delivers difficult scoring performances. Meanwhile, some fans feel Caitlin Clark receives a different level of scrutiny, pointing to comments, coaching decisions, and challenge usage as examples. Whether fair or unfair, those perceptions continue to gain attention because patterns matter in sports. And once fans believe they see a pattern, every new situation gets examined through that lens. The media members covering the team notice these discussions as well. Reporters understand when access is controlled, when topics become sensitive, and when certain questions are harder to ask. Some may choose to focus on maintaining relationships and access. Others quietly take notes and wait for opportunities to address larger concerns when circumstances allow. That's simply part of how sports media operates. What makes this situation important is that it likely won't disappear on its own. Either the coaching staff finds solutions to the recurring defensive issues and changes the conversation, or the pressure surrounding those issues continues to grow. Either leadership within the organization demands stronger results, or critics will argue that the same problems are being allowed to continue unchecked. because ultimately, talent alone doesn't guarantee championships. A team can have elite players and still fall short if the defensive system doesn't match the roster, if the offense becomes too predictable, if key strategic decisions continue raising questions, and if accountability isn't shared across the entire organization. At some point, every contender reaches a ceiling unless those issues are addressed before the postseason arrives. The Atlanta Dream may have done more than just win a game. They may have exposed some of the biggest questions surrounding this team. Giving up 60 points in the paint, allowing 20 points off turnovers, and surrendering 17 fast break points are the kinds of numbers that immediately raise concerns. Yet what stood out afterward was hearing praise for the opponent's execution in areas where Indiana has struggled to establish consistency itself. At the same time, much of the post-game discussion focused on player execution rather than whether the system itself needs adjustments. Then, before many of the tougher questions could be explored, the press conference was over in roughly 2.5 minutes. Eventually, every organization has to evaluate itself honestly. Stephanie White challenged her players to do exactly that, but some fans are now asking when that same level of self-evaluation will be applied to the coaching staff. When will there be a moment where coaching decisions, defensive preparation, rotations, and in-game adjustments become part of the accountability conversation? When does responsibility start moving upward instead of stopping with the players on the court? Those are the questions gaining momentum right now. So here's the bigger debate. Is Stephanie White still the right long-term coach for this group? Can these defensive issues be corrected under her leadership, or are they signs of deeper problems with the current approach? Is the system simply going through growing pains, or does it require significant changes moving forward? And what role should the front office play in evaluating those results? Should there be more transparency and tougher questions after performances like this, or is the criticism becoming too harsh too quickly? That's where the conversation gets interesting. I want to hear your perspective. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you think the criticism is justified or whether Stephanie White deserves more time to turn things around. And if you enjoy breakdowns that go beyond the headlines and dig into the bigger picture behind these stories, make sure to subscribe because this situation is still developing and it feels like there are plenty more chapters left to be written.